as World War II entered its final years, the Battleship found itself at the tail end of almost a decade-long design cycle that had seen its mission profile change in ways that probably hadn't even been seen in the period surrounding the launch of HMS Dreadnought, at least in terms of the speed of this change. In 1935, the Battleship was supposed to be a 35,000-ton ship armed with 14-inch guns, heavily regulated by treaty, and, while acknowledging the air threat, this was usually limited in response to a battery of single-purpose or dual-purpose heavy anti-aircraft guns, which it turned out people had put far too much faith in with the technology available at the time, along with a handful of light and medium close-in machine guns and autocannons. To engage the enemy meant using optical rangefinders to put a Mark I human eyeball on the target and feed that data to electromechanical computers. Shortly thereafter, the treaty system had collapsed, and the late 1930s had been spent escalating gun caliber, adding the newfangled radar, which could first spot aircraft and then was used to spot ships, with some sketches being made for ships that would also significantly exceed the old treaty limit for size, or, in some cases, further exceed those limits. The early 1940s had seen radar advance from just spotting to being able to guide an engagement. Fire control systems had entered the realm of being able to engage targets no matter what the ship's twists and turns were or what the weather was. Secondary and anti-aircraft batteries had been networked together, the machine gun had vanished, and huge numbers of anti-aircraft autocannon in various calibers had appeared. Designs, and in some cases actual ships, well in excess of 35,000 tons had been made, and the advent of guided missiles and rockets meant that jammers and latterly heavy auto-loading anti-aircraft guns had begun to compete for space on the decks and superstructures. The rise of the carrier had seen the death of the last notions of fast and slow battleships in the old terms. Now, a ship that could hit 28 knots, previously the hallmark of a fast battleship, was barely viable. 30 knots or more was almost a minimum bar to entry, and although the core of a battleship remained its heavy guns and armour plate, massively more displacement was taken up with dealing with other threats, torpedoes and mines underwater, as well as all sorts of incoming aerial threats. Previously best thought of as mobile artillery platforms that sought to decide campaigns or even wars in a few furious hours of battle, the modern battleship of 1944 and 1945 was now something more akin to a mobile fortress that had to withstand a prolonged siege coming in from all angles, and this siege might last days or even weeks. The battleships that had or were about to enter service in the late war or the immediate post-war period, Iowa's, Vanguard, the reconstructed Jean Bart, were still reflections of battleship design from 1940, somewhat adapted in the details during construction, and in the former case, service during the war, but with the Lion class in the UK having been cancelled and the Montanas in the US suffering the same fate, the question remains, was there anything planned or thought of in terms of battleship construction that post-dates these ships? The answer is yes. Towards the end of World War II, and in some cases thereafter, there was still some design work going on for the next generation of battleships, but compared to pre-war, the number of nations undertaking this work was much reduced. Italy had formally bowed out of the war in 1943, although the land itself continued to be a battleground for pretty much the rest of the conflict, with some Italian forces continuing to fight on either side depending on their political alignment. Thus, no work had been done in the latter stages of the war, and post-war the economy had almost been physically destroyed, whilst political upheaval in the immediate post-war years alongside Allied peace terms meant that there was no chance of Italy building new warships of any particular scale. Germany, outside the fever dreams of the H-42 through to H-44 sketches, which were more to try and make their designers look busy enough so they couldn't be sent to the Eastern Front than anything else, hadn't seriously considered new capital ship design for the majority of the war, and post-war the country was in the process of being divided up by the victorious Allies. Again, there would be no battleship design work going on here. Japan had been reduced to largely on fire and, latterly, mildly radioactive. The number of surviving major warships that were left to the Imperial Japanese Navy could have been counted unaided by Admiral Yamamoto's remaining fingers, had he survived the war, and those few ships were going to be hauled off for scrap or atom bomb testing soon enough, with an American occupation force already in the country and a new constitution that renounced war and military force altogether. There was zero chance of any new warship design, let alone a battleship, coming from that quarter. France had been on the winning side, but with various parts of it having been under German occupation for various periods of time, before then becoming the front line for much of the campaign in Western Europe from D-Day almost through to the end of the war, she was also in no state to contemplate new warships and would instead be completing and repairing existing hulls for quite some time. That left three major navies: the American, the British, and the Soviet. The latter somewhat late to the game as a major navy. All three would look at the potential of new battleships, but none would ever be built. Still, it is informative to look at the programs for each respective nation and see why the battleship, as an ongoing design project, died in the fires of the Second World War, even if some already finished examples would continue to give good service for decades to come. American battleship designs after the cancellation of the Montanas consisted primarily of two streams of work. The first was actually continuing with various modifications to the Montana class's layout, as the ships under construction had been cancelled in July 1943, but this was 2 years after they were supposed to have been laid down. And in the gap between those two dates, wartime experience had been brought in to see what might have been changed if the ships had been restarted. So we'll look at that line of thought first. The US Navy had concluded that with the outbreak of war, enemy nations would probably stop building battleships altogether, or at the very least, they'd stop developing new designs and maybe just finish off the ones they'd already begun. And so the Montana's armor belt, which was designed to be proof against the 16-inch 50 caliber gun firing super heavy shells at normal battle ranges, might actually be overdoing it a little, bearing in mind that this is 1942 and the fact that the Yamatos were mounting 18.1-inch guns hadn't quite yet been realised. Conversely, a wide and worrying variety of airdropped semi-armour piercing and armour-piercing bombs of distressingly increasing size were being seen being deployed over in the European theatre and also over in the Pacific, with the Japanese adapting 16-inch shells into armour-piercing bombs at Pearl Harbor. Two options were suggested, the starting point being, of course, the 16-inch belt armour and the approximately 6 inches of main armour deck on the original design. Option 1 was to reduce the belt armour to 12.1 inches, i.e. reverting back to the belt that was found on the Iowa class, and then use the saved weight to add to deck armour. The Montanas had a thin bomb deck designed to initiate airdropped projectiles, which was well above the main armour deck. Including the STS steel deck plates themselves, as well as the laminated armour plates placed atop them, this, plus the main armour deck, represented about 9.3 inches of metal to a bomb, before it managed to get somewhere particularly vital. Although, thanks to the weaknesses of lamination, this was calculated to be ballistically equivalent to about 7.3 inches, which wasn't all that much more than the 6-inch slab that made up the main deck armour plate. Just how much greater the deck's armour surface area is compared to the belt surface area can be seen that by reducing the belt by 4 inches, you could only buy a approximately 1.1 inch increase to the total physical deck thickness for the same weight, and about a 1 inch increase in ballistic equivalent thickness, this going to 10.4 inches of actual steel, which was equivalent to 8.3 inches of solid plate, respectively. Option 2 was to split the difference between the Iowa protective scheme for the belt and the original Montana scheme and go with a 14-inch belt, with the resulting increase in deck armor being ballistically equivalent to about 8 inches of metal instead of 8.3 inches with the option 1. Either option seems to have largely focused on increasing the bomb deck thickness, as heavier bombs would need this layer to resist more in order to actually initiate them in the first place. Keeping the bomb deck as it was against a heavy armor-piercing bomb would have relatively little effect on said bomb, and thus leave the main armor deck to deal with it almost as if the bomb deck hadn't been there at all. However, nothing came from these ideas, and some of the last recorded work, at least that to my knowledge has been found thus far, was looking at trying to improve the ship's anti-aircraft firepower. This consisted of making the Montana hull longer, and thus heavier, but without any substantial increase to the machinery, which would have dropped its top speed to about 27 knots. The idea seems to have been to try and get all of the heavy dual-purpose anti-aircraft guns on a single level, but still maintaining good arcs of fire, which would then allow the 40mm Bofors armament to be on one level, one deck higher, where the upper 5-inch mounts would have been in the original design, and this would also give the 40mm Bofors better arcs of fire. 3 options were considered. The first was just elongating the ship, and then looking at changing the secondary battery to either have 8, 6, or even no 5-inch 54 twin mounts, with the reductions being paid for with increases to the ship's 40mm and 20mm armament, bearing in mind that in 1942, when this work was initially undertaken, the 20mm Oerlikon was still considered a viable anti-aircraft weapon, as opposed to 1945, by which time the 40mm Bofors was just about the minimum price of admission to serious anti-aircraft defence. The next option removed the aft super-firing turret, taking the main battery down to 9 guns, the resulting space being used to spread out the same secondary battery options as in the first case, even more, thus improving their fire arcs. And the last option was the 9-gun option, but with some of the internal hull space, thanks to lengthening the ship, given over to a bit more machinery to try and claw back some of the speed. But it seems that this was about as far as it went with the Montanas, as all work on them seems to have stopped with the July 1943 decision to cancel them. The other, much more prolonged stream of work focused on the Iowa class, not the 4 that would actually enter service, but the incomplete Illinois and Kentucky, or possibly even successors to them. There are a few memos and notes suggesting that in 1944 some thought was being given to an improved Iowa design, primarily aimed at addressing a few design flaws that had been found in the original class that hadn't been able to be addressed with the slightly revised Illinois and Kentucky. The speed of the ships, and thus their ability to keep pace with the carrier groups, was seen as favourable, but this seems to have been, again, pending further documents potentially coming to light, to have been largely speculative work. The next stage came post-war, and most of these efforts would centre on the Kentucky. The first wave of designs looked at replacing the 16-inch 50 caliber turrets with auto-loading 8-inch guns, similar to those found on the Des Moines-class cruisers. To avoid repetition, I will refer you to a video that I did previously on exactly these ideas. There's a link in the description below, and possibly, if I remember to put it in here, somewhere up on the screen as well. Now, in addition to just sticking a bunch of 8-inch guns on instead of the 16-inch 50 caliber weapons, there was also an idea of a 4-inch sabot round with a rocket attached to it that could be loaded in as a kind of ultra-long-range anti-aircraft projectile, with this round being fitted with a proximity fuse. Someone also proposed the idea of another kind of main gun. Caliber a little bit unclear, but the idea was to step back a century to making the gun a smoothbore, which would then fire the next logical evolution to the above-mentioned rocket sabot projectile, a gun-launched guided missile, possibly assisted into the skies by some kind of small charge if they could get the guidance system on the missile to survive the sudden acceleration. These plans were all largely dropped almost as fast as they were generated, barely clearing the back of a napkin stage. The last gasp of battleship design, as opposed to a slightly sketchy plan in the late 1950s to stick almost a Nimitz-class carrier's worth of shaft horsepower into a North Carolina-class and or a South Dakota-class to see if you could make it break 31 knots, was a 1955 idea for a one-ship battle group. This consisted of replacing the aft turret with a set of launchers for a number of Regulus II nuclear-tipped cruise missiles. 4 of the 5-inch mounts would be replaced with Terrier or Talos surface-to-air missiles, and the light and medium anti-aircraft installations would be supplanted by 10 twin automatic 3-inch mounts. Oh, and of course, since this was the 1950s and nuclear everything was apparently in vogue, the 16-inch guns would be able to fire nuclear shells, and the Talos missiles would have optional nuclear warheads as well. But believe it or not, that wasn't the most nuclear option. The final gasp of this line of thinking was to essentially gut the hull and then either install a magazine with 16 liquid-fueled nuclear ballistic missiles, which would be fired one at a time by a giant tower and crane set up amidships. The fore and aft main turret positions would be replaced by 4 twin Talos launchers, also possibly nuclear-tipped, remember, along with a dozen twin Tartar launchers down the sides. Presumably these would be conventionally tipped, but only because large airburst nuclear warheads didn't fit on them, and no one had made the logical leap to sticking Davy Crockett warheads on them and then taping some nails to the outside of the resulting monstrosity for some plasma-based shrapnel effects. The other option, which, believe it or not, was actually a little more sane, had just 2 twin Talos launchers, 4 twin Terrier launchers, and 4 twin 3-inch automatic anti-aircraft guns for defence, and this had a mere dozen nuclear-tipped intermediate-range ballistic missiles aboard, but this time these were in 2 rows of 6 vertical launch system tubes, which ran fore to aft amidships from behind the superstructure. The greater room needed for this missile farm meant that the ship's speed would drop to just over 27 knots as the forward machinery spaces had to be deleted to make room for the ballistic missiles. A scaled-down version of the Regulus idea was also proposed, as was an updated missile ship idea where 8 Polaris missiles, with somewhat more comforting solid fuel systems, would be placed further aft than the liquid-fueled options, along with ASROC, Talos, and other systems installed elsewhere. But, with the death of these ideas at the end of the 1950s, the line of continuous US battleship development was quietly taken out back and given the old Yeller treatment. Various twitches would return, the 1970s idea to turn USS New Jersey into the world's largest Aegis platform, and later a battle carrier, for example, but that's well past the scope of the channel. With all that said, the scope of British efforts now seem relatively tame in comparison. Albeit there was no lack of insanity to some of their proposals, it just wasn't quite so instant sunshine in a can. During the war, the British had kept updating the Lion-class design in the hopes of someday restarting production, in the course of which it had grown from a 40,000-ton design to around 45,000 tons, and they'd applied some of the lessons in these redesigns to the stop-start construction of Vanguard. But in 1944, planners began looking to the future. The previous deck protection schemes had been based on resisting a 1,000-pound bomb, which was a reasonable enough supposition in an era when the only dive bombers carrying something in that weight range were the Dauntlesses of the US Navy, but as the war went on, the Germans were strapping increasingly improbable bomb loads to the poor Stukas, even to the point where both significant amounts of fuel and the entire rear gunner had to be left behind. And later they had deployed, using slightly more capable aircraft, a limited number of rocket-assisted armour-piercing bombs that weighed up to 4,000 pounds, and of course the radio-guided approximately 3,000 pound Fritz X. This would necessitate substantially more deck armour. The main deck was calculated to be at least 7.5 inches thick if you wanted to repel a 4,000-pound bomb. But unlike the US plans, which seemed to focus on aerial threats as primarily being bombs, with torpedoes dealt with separately by the torpedo defence system, the British had typically gone and got themselves worried about a weapon which they themselves had invented, on the principle that if they could invent it, surely anyone else could. During the war, they'd fitted some of the rather distinctive RP-3 rockets with solid warheads. These were designed to survive entry into the water, which would then give rocket-fitted aircraft the ability to attack a U-boat at shallow depth, say if one was caught snorkeling. The resulting holes that the rockets punched in the hull would not sink the submarine immediately, but would force it to surface, or risk being sunk by continuous flooding. But in use, they noticed that as many or more hits were scored by rockets that had actually fallen a little bit short. For various complicated reasons to do with hydrodynamics and projectiles entering water at speed, at an angle from the air, the rockets which hit the water tended to steer themselves upwards until they were travelling almost level. This, of course, meant that you could try and attack ships more easily. A direct hit was, after all, a direct hit, but if you triggered the salvo of rockets fractionally earlier than you would normally, this would mean that all the short rockets might well punch holes in the target below the waterline, and possibly, if you're going after a big target, even below the armour. At the end of the war, this idea had been run with to develop the much larger Uncle Tom rocket, which was about 11 inches in diameter and loaded with a rather hefty explosive warhead behind a semi-armour-piercing tip. It was just a fraction smaller than the American Tiny Tim, and was designed specifically to exploit this underwater attack profile. The idea would later be developed into the even faster Red Angel rocket, which had the same mission idea, just with larger targets in mind. This meant that Royal Navy designers now had to worry about somebody else using a high-speed underwater rocket projectile with a 100-pound warhead against them, as well as some kind of physical defence against said rockets to try and deal with the aircraft themselves that might be carrying the rockets or any other kind of ordnance. The heavy dual-purpose battery on the current iteration of the Battleship design was switched from the 5.25-inch to the new twin 4.5-inch boxy mounting as found in things like the Daring-class destroyer, which offered 3 times the rate of fire of the 5.25-inch if the autoloader system decided to work on that particular day, but even if you were hand-loading it, you still got a 50% increase in rate of fire. The smaller size of the mount also meant that a dozen of them could be carried instead of the 8 twin 5.25s that could be found on the King George V's and HMS Vanguard, so substantially more shells in the air. The 20mm Oerlikon would be done away with entirely in favour of a series of sextuple 40mm Bofors mountings, each of which had their own ranging radar as well as, of course, links to central fire control. But while the US Navy had to struggle with the Panama Canal lock widths as their primary antagonist for ship size, the British had a more fundamental problem. There was a size limit imposed of 840 foot by 118 foot. This was seen as the largest ship that could be comfortably serviced in the dockyards across the Empire. Larger docks did exist. Hood had been 860 foot after all, but they weren't common. To fit all of the new armament choices, plus, of course, the 3 triple 16-inch gun turrets, potentially with partial autoloading to reduce the reload time to a reliable 20 seconds, was calculated to need a ship of just over 50,000 tons standard displacement if you wanted to reach 28 knots when the ship was fully loaded but fresh out of dock with an 830-foot long hull. But, of course, endurance would suffer the longer the ship was out at sea and the fouler the hull became. To install more power to overcome this and bring endurance up to 6,000 nautical miles at 25 knots in tropical waters whilst the ship was heavily fouled and deeply loaded would require almost another 3,000 tons. To boost that worst-case 6,000 nautical mile range up to being accomplished at 28 knots meant enough power to give a top speed whilst the ship was fresh out of dock to 31.5 knots, but it pushed displacement to 57,500 tons and would need 235,000 shaft horsepower. equivalent to the power plant of a Midway-class aircraft carrier, plus the entire power plant of HMS Dreadnought tacked onto it. Again, looking at that worst-case condition, but with the endurance of 6,000 nautical miles accomplished at 30 knots, it was calculated that you would need a ship of 62,700 tons standard displacement, just over 70,000 tons when fully loaded, which would put the ship only a hair away from Yamato with both ships at full loading. But to reach that speed, which would be obviously even faster when the ship was clean and out of dock fresh, would need a whopping 320,000 shaft horsepower, or the equivalent to the engine power of the then future nuclear-powered carrier Enterprise CVN-65, plus the entire power plant of a Nelson-class battleship tacked on at the back. Quite how you were going to transfer this power down 4 propeller shafts was a question that nobody really wanted to think about. It was, of course, almost enough to make you give up on the idea of armour entirely, since hauling around 15 inches of belt armour and 6 inches of main deck armour was hauling around a lot of weight, and if you got rid of that weight, you could get up to the necessary speed without needing anywhere near as insane an amount of power. And then, just to make the designers cry some more, some utter genius took a look at the already supersonic 12,000-pound Tallboy bomb, the weapon which had, bear in mind, completely overpenetrated both turpits and U-boat pens, and decided this clearly was not powerful enough, and what you really needed when you were going to try and deliver 2.5 tons of Torpex to someone you really didn't like at really high speed was, of course, to attach a rocket motor to the back of it to make it even faster and increase its penetration still further. Trying to at least get protection against most weapons, if not hyperspace-enabled Tallboys, the Director of Naval Construction went back to the drawing board and announced it was indeed possible to have a ship with full armour around the magazines, if you dropped a couple of inches from the belt and deck over the machinery, and it would also accommodate all the guns and sensors that you wanted. You could also add in a torpedo defence system that could cope with a torpedo carrying a 1,200-pound warhead, and it also allowed for a 2.5-inch bulkhead below the waterline, which would stop underwater rocketry. The 6,000 nautical mile range speed would only be 20 knots, but top speed would still be fine around 30 knots in clean condition. Of course, all you needed to accomplish this was a ship that was over 1,000 foot long and 120 foot wide, with a displacement of around 70,000 tons at full load. Admiral Fisher's ghost was probably frantically pointing at the HMS Incomparable and screaming that he'd told them so almost 3 decades earlier. Concluding that this was perhaps not entirely feasible, they tried to pare down the design, shortening the citadel as much as possible, but every design still came in at well over 900 feet. Someone briefly pointed out that since hits from shell fire had been relatively rare compared to hits from bombs in World War II, and that with the new radar systems they could engage at long distances where deck hits were perhaps more likely anyway, maybe the battleship should concentrate on relatively minimal belt protection, just enough to set off heavy shells, with a nice splinter bulkhead further back to catch the resulting fragments. The belt would still repel cruiser and smaller ship gunfire, but all that saved weight could be put into the deck, which could be made a full foot thick, 12 inches of armour plate steel decking. That should stop even a rocket-powered Tallboy. Given how quickly this line of inquiry dried up, one can only assume that the designer in question was quickly taken away in a straitjacket and sectioned. As World War II began to wind down, another missive from on high suggested that the design be altered again to incorporate the new GAP system, or Guided Anti-Air Projectile, which we would today call a SAM, or Surface-to-Air Missile. It was suggested that the 12 twin 4.5-inch guns should be reduced to 8 twin mounts. The 4 mounts were then to be replaced by 4 GAP launchers, which it was predicted should be of about the same size and weight. Given that the GAP program would inevitably evolve into the Sea Slug missile, which I could charitably describe as half a mains electrical pylon mounted on a gimbal trying to launch something that resembled a particularly militant man in a shed's attempt at a moon rocket, and whose launcher, blast radius and magazine would take up much of the entire aft volume of a number of Cold War escort ships, the idea that you could replace a twin 4.5-inch mount 1-for-1 with that thing was about as optimistic as a man who, upon seeing the approach of a particularly hungry megalodon, decided that underwater fisticuffs would resolve the situation in his favour. This, and bearing in mind at this stage in proceedings the Allied armies had yet to drive the Wehrmacht back over the Rhine, prompted the wholesale abandonment of this line of thinking. The next month, things reconvened with the idea to reduce the belt armour to 10 inches, keep the deck armour at 6 inches, and otherwise maintain the armament, perhaps paring the torpedo defence system down to resist only a 1,000-pound warhead, on a much smaller ship size. This ship design was still too large, but it turned out that removing one of the turrets, taking into account the expected 20-second reload cycle that would give a round per minute similar to 3 triples in any other ship, if that other ship was really going for it, and also removing 4 of the 4.5-inch mounts, managed to bring the design down to just under 47,000 tons and 800 feet long. Now it seemed that they had a ship that they might actually be able to build. But of course, now that they had this, the designers wandered off down other roads less travelled, looking at perhaps a longer super heavy shell, akin to the US Mark 8. That, it was worked out, would add 2,000 tons to the displacement if you wanted to keep the same number of shells in the magazine, because you'd have to make everything down there bigger. Another 4,000 tons would be added to the design if you brought in a 16-inch 50 caliber gun instead of the projected 16-inch 45 caliber weapon. Eventually, it was decided that they would stick with the 45 caliber weapon, but they'd make a somewhat heavier 16-inch shell, which was a little bit longer than the one they'd been looking at originally, but not as long as a true super heavy. But of course, no one seems to have communicated any of this back up the line, and so when the next battleship requirement was issued, the General Staff was still assuming the ship would have 3 triple turrets and 24 4.5-inch guns. Having then clued in the higher-ups as to the status of what could and couldn't realistically be built, it was decided to see just how low you could go, and a 35,500-ton ship was devised that used 2 triple main turrets and 8 twin 4.5-inch mounts, but with armour and torpedo defence systems that were more akin to the battle cruiser Renown, with a few modifications to resist the underwater rocketry. Speed would be about 29 knots, and it would have to rely on dodging anything that was heavier than an 8-inch shell, but it would also be cheap. You could get 6 inches of deck armour on it if you allowed standard displacement to rise to 36,800 tons, but neither option had any significant torpedo defence system to speak of, reverting instead to massive compartmentalisation akin to the 1870s ironclad Italia instead. If you wanted to go up to 37,200 tons, you could get all 12 of the twin 4.5-inch guns back, as long as you put the 2 triple main turrets forward, which resulted in something that looked like a cut-price Richelieu, but with so little protection that a single bomb hit might disable the entire main battery. All of these designs were reviewed, and the board decided to throw in other ideas. You could perhaps save 4,000 tons by downgrading to 15-inch guns. You could mix and match features of all these previous designs into an 850-foot long hull, split the main guns into 3 twins instead of 2 triples, and push the speed up to 32 knots. And then things got even weirder. There was a suggestion to eliminate all of the armour over the machinery, because of course engines are not really that important. Also, they were asked to consider, well, what about 14-inch guns, 15-inch guns, and 16-inch guns, fortunately not all on the same ship, but in a variety of twin, triple or quadruple layouts. And with all this going on, I do find it somewhat wondrous that the Director of Naval Construction at the time, Sir Charles Lillicrap, actually made it to the age of 79, dying in 1966, as opposed to being overcome with apoplexy or spontaneous combustion on the spot. The end of the war in Europe came with a mutant combination of features being requested. It settled on 2 triple 16-inch turrets mounted forward, 12 4.5-inch twin mounts aft, 12.5 inches of armour over the magazines, an inch less over the machinery, and 6 inches and 4 inches of deck armour over those 2 respective areas, with subdivision and bulkheads to resist near-miss bomber hits and underwater rockets, and a top speed of 29 knots on an 850-foot long hull if you were measuring at the waterline. This ship was estimated to displace just over 45,000 tons, with displacement rising rapidly if you tried to go any faster. The Admiralty asked, well, what about using quadruple 15-inch guns instead of triple 16-inch? At which point you might as well have just given the French economy a shot in the arm and bought Richelieu and Jean Bart, swapped out the secondary guns and called it a day. Nonetheless, the Director of Naval Construction came back with word that this would increase displacement by about 2,000 tons, as the larger turrets would cost 400 tons, and the additional ammunition, the larger barbette that would be needed, etc., would make up the rest. This is almost where it ended. There was one more brief flare-up of reverting back to 3 triple 16-inch turrets, but at some point in 1945, probably once war with Japan had been wrapped up and the government realised just how utterly broke the UK was, everything seems to have quietly slipped away. Over the rest of the 1940s, small amounts of hopeful work on the 16-inch guns and their triple turrets was done, largely on the grounds that although most work on battleship design had stopped, there had been no official word that new battleships might not be called for, until eventually someone got around to issuing the memo that we weren't going to build any further battleships in 1949, and the Director of Naval Construction could get on with slightly less stressful activities, like punching sharks, wrestling crocodiles, and taking a vacation to Australia with a stated objective to boot the snoot of every single snake he came across. Speaking of high-pressure work environments, Stalin's Soviet Union. The Sovietsky Soyuz, or Project 23, and its subsequent proposed refinements and variants are thankfully all pre-war and early war projects. But one battleship, as opposed to battlecruiser program, falls into the period covered by this video. That would be Project 24. This had started in late 1940 when it became clear the problems with the Sovietsky Soyuzes had led to pages of red ink, and not in a good way, even in a communist system. Still, optimistically thinking the Soyuzes would be launched in 1943, it was decided to try and start over with a clean sheet design, which in theory would then be ready to use the shipyards. Of course, instead of trying to make a ship that actually met the previous specifications, the specifications themselves were also increased. Now, the ship would have to move at 30 knots, carry somewhere between 24 and 32 4-inch anti-aircraft guns, plus a dozen 6-inch guns in a split secondary battery. The armour would need to be improved, the Italian torpedo defence system was going to be abandoned in favour of a layered system, the underside of the hull was supposed to have some kind of protection against magnetic mines and torpedoes, and the seaplane complement would now be half a squadron. And the ship would have to sail further carrying all of this. Given that Project 23 had missed much more modest goals, there was of course no pressure at all, right? Various plans percolated through the wartime environment, less a concern for this video, but they looked at 9-gun or 12-gun layouts with 16 or 18-inch guns and displacements ranging from 75,000 tons to 130,000 tons. By the time we hit the late war period, though, we're back into the zone of study for this video, and at this stage it was clear that the Western Allies were working on or finishing off ships that they'd started earlier in the war. The Soviets correctly surmised that Vanguard and Jean Bart would be completed, and less accurately guessed Kentucky would also show up at some point. It was also clear that no one had any immediate plans to try and build anything particularly larger. And so 6-digit displacements were abandoned, and it was decided that Project 24 would focus on a ship that could beat the Iowas, which of course were notionally a little bit over 45,000 ton standard displacement back then. Clearly then, 10 75,000 ton battleships was what the Soviet Union needed. Whilst the Soviet Navy actually didn't really want them, and sought to push off their notional build dates as far as possible, Comrade Stalin was still vaguely enamoured of a surface fleet, and drawing pretty ships kept people out of Gulag, so a spec was drawn up for a 75,000 ton ship with 9 16-inch guns, 2 dozen dual-purpose 5.1-inch guns, a variety of lighter weapons, with the whole thing armoured to withstand 16-inch gunfire in reasonable battle ranges, as well as being protected against a 2,200-pound bomb dropped from 10,000 feet, although how you were supposed to hit a ship from that altitude was never quite discussed, and it was also supposed to be protected against a torpedo carrying a 2,000-pound warhead. The ship in question had to be capable of 30 knots. Then it was change places! The design bureau that heretofore had been concerned with battleship construction was retasked with mass production of smaller ships, and the design bureau that had previously overseen cruisers and destroyers was now tasked with designing battleships, as well as continuing all the cruiser projects that were still ongoing. Eventually, in 1948, some of the staff was split off to work on Project 24 and what would eventually become the Stalingrad-class battlecruisers. Work on Project 24 went slowly, as Stalin had fixated on the Stalingrads, and part of the reason for the massive size discrepancy compared to the Iowas seems to have been something which I can only imagine being some CIA agent IDing a Russian spy and then deciding to play a game of see exactly how much nonsense I can feed him before he realises, with the answer being as much as you possibly can. Whatever the exact process was, the Soviet notes from this period indicate that they believed that the Iowa class had 19-inch thick belt armour and was capable of over 35 knots. As a result, displacement and gun calibre crept up again until Stalin told them to stick with the 16-inch guns or else, and later in 1950, the Navy Minister also ordered a return to a mere 75,000 ton displacement. This was pared down further by mounting some of the secondary guns on the centreline, which would allow the elimination of their opposite pairs if they were on the wings, but then the Ministry of Shipbuilding stepped in. There were always multiple competing authorities in Soviet ship design. They proposed an entirely new idea, a much smaller ship, 2 or 3 of which could in theory be built for the cost of the one monster vessel. These small ships would also potentially cover the requirements of Project 82, the Stalingrads, and thus would allow them to produce a single run of one type of capital ship. To deal with the fantasy monster Iowas that they thought existed, it was proposed to resurrect a tactic that had been used by the Imperial Russian Navy in World War I in the Black Sea, only now with more modern radio and radar equipment. And this was simply to have several of these smaller ships sail together and link their fire control systems so that all the ships fired as one on the same target. This had worked to a degree in allowing Russian pre-dreadnoughts to face off against the individually superior battlecruiser Yavut Sultan Selim, the ex-Goeben back in the First World War, so surely modern technology would make the task even easier. And of course, if you were taking on this monster Iowa and it blew one of the ships out of the water, well, you still had 2 others to keep on firing. The good idea comrade then showed up, and recommendations emerged for each ship to have a small number of 18-inch guns, with an extensive secondary battery of heavy cruiser-grade weapons to fire high explosive at high angles, the objective ostensibly being to smash up enemy fire control and radar in a hail of shells. After having had it explained to them that you weren't actually trying to recreate pre-dreadnoughts, and in any case the USSR didn't actually have any 18-inch guns, 3 designs were then drawn up. All of them had 10 inches of armour over the magazines with 7 inches elsewhere, with approximately 5-inch thick decks, and speeds of just over 30 knots, except for the largest design, which was supposed to do almost 33 knots. The reason for the 10 inches of armour was that it was assumed the ships would fight almost bow on. Anti-aircraft batteries were also identical, 12 twin 57mm guns and 12 quad 25mm guns. The main batteries, however, were very different. The smallest ship was 29,700 ton standard displacement and had a single triple 16-inch turret forward and a quad 7.1-inch turret aft. The superstructure on all three designs was quite low, and the ships were designed, as said, to fight bow on, so one supposes that this combination of factors with the superstructure was to allow the aft turret to fire over the superstructure as long as it was at a high elevation. It was certainly positioned far enough back to do so. The next design, despite instructions, did have a single twin 18-inch turret forward and a quad 8.7-inch turret aft. Presumably the designer hadn't got that no 18-inch memo just yet. And the final design, which was the fast one, was 39,250 tons, which was hardly small, and it had a twin 16-inch turret forward with a triple 16-inch turret superfiring over that for a total of 5 main guns, and a quad 7.1-inch turret mounted really far back. Having decided it liked the idea of at least one of these rather odd ships, the Ministry of the Navy ordered further detailed studies to be done. But then Stalin went and died, and with a collective sigh of relief, the entire idea was quickly dropped and forgotten about. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is why nobody built any new battleships after the end of World War II.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.